In the autumn of 1942, the German army was a master of Europe, but by the winter of 1944, it was a cornered animal waiting for the final blow. Yet, in the silence of the snowy forest, Adolf Hitler was preparing one last, desperate gamble, a massive counterstroke designed to shatter the Western Alliance. But the seeds of its failure were planted long before the first shot was fired, rooted in a fatal delay that turned a bold plan into a suicide mission. If you want to understand the hidden decisions that define history, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss a revelation. To understand why the offensive came too late, we must look at the calendar. It was late 1944. The Allies had swept through France and Belgium, liberating Paris and Brussels. To the east, the Soviet steamroller was temporarily paused on the Vistula River, inside the Wolf's Lair and later the Adlerhorst, Eagle's Nest. Headquarters in the west, Hitler had withdrawn into a world of maps and phantom divisions. He conceived a plan codenamed Wacht am Rhine, Watch on the Rhine. The concept was terrifyingly simple. Punch a massive armored fist through the weakly held Ardennes sector, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp. Hitler believed that by retaking Antwerp, he could cut off the Allied supply lines and trap four Allied armies, the British 21st Army Group and the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies. He wasn't trying to conquer the world anymore. He was trying to force a negotiated peace. He believed that the alliance between the decadent democratic West and the communist East was unnatural and fragile. If he could deal the Americans and British a colossal defeat, he thought they would sue for peace, leaving Germany free to turn all its strength against the Soviets. But the timing was everything. The plan relied on two critical factors: total surprise and bad weather. The German Luftwaffe had been decimated. The Allies had total air supremacy. If the German panzers moved while the skies were clear, they would be obliterated by American thunderbolts and British typhoons before they even reached the front line. Therefore, Hitler had to wait for a period of heavy fog and storms to ground the Allied air forces. This requirement for bad weather introduced the first fatal delay. The offensive was originally tentatively scheduled for November. Had it launched then, the Allied supply lines were still overextended, and the port of Antwerp was not yet fully operational for the Allies. The confusion in the Allied command was at its peak in the autumn. But the weather in November didn't cooperate, and the German units were not ready. The railways, battered by bombing, couldn't move the fuel and ammunition fast enough. Week after agonizing week, the date slipped from late November to early December. Every day of delay allowed the Allies to consolidate their gains. General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery were using this time to build up their own logistics. The broad front strategy meant the Allies were slowly grinding forward, chewing up German reserves that should have been saved for the counteroffensive. The German generals, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Walter Model, were horrified by the plan. They looked at the map and saw that the roads in the Ardennes were narrow, twisting tracks through dense forests, completely unsuitable for heavy Tiger and Panther tanks. They argued for a smaller, more manageable small solution to pinch off the American salient at Aachen. Hitler refused. He wanted the big solution. He wanted Antwerp. This rigidity meant that the German army had to assemble a force it couldn't sustain. They scraped together the last reserves of the Third Reich. The 6th Panzer Army, led by the fanatical SS General Sepp Dietrich, was given the best equipment. The 5th Panzer Army, under the aristocratic General Otto von Manschenfeld, was given the secondary role. They gathered 200,000 men, 1,800 tanks, and 19,000 artillery pieces. They stripped the Eastern Front bare, a decision that would haunt them weeks later. But the assembly took too long. By the time the force was ready in mid-December, the strategic window was already closing. The Allies were becoming stronger by the day. The Ghost Front in the Ardennes, held by tired American units sent there to rest and green units fresh from the States, was indeed weak, but the reserves behind them were growing. The most critical shortage was fuel. The plan assumed the Germans would capture American fuel dumps to keep moving. It was a strategy built on hope, not logistics. They needed to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours and Antwerp in a week. Any delay, any traffic jam, any stubborn resistance would doom the entire enterprise. As December 15th dawned, the meteorologists finally predicted a heavy storm front coming in from the Atlantic. The skies would turn gray, grounding the Allied planes. The Hitler weather had arrived, but it was already the middle of winter. The days were short, offering limited daylight for fighting. The ground was not yet frozen hard enough in all places, leaving a muddy morass that would suck the tracks off the tanks. The stage was set for the last great gamble. The German soldiers, told that this battle would decide the fate of the fatherland, moved into their jump-off positions under the cover of darkness and noise discipline. Across the line, the American GIs were preparing for a quiet Christmas, unaware that the force in front of them was hiding the last great assembly of the Wehrmacht. The offensive was about to begin, but the calendar was already their greatest enemy. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes was ripped apart by a barrage that reminded veterans of the worst days of World War I. But while the initial shock was absolute, the clock immediately began to tick against the attackers, turning every minute delay into a strategic catastrophe. Before we analyze the chaos of those opening hours, hit that subscribe button to join our community of historians uncovering the truth of the past. The German attack achieved complete tactical surprise. The American intelligence services had failed colossally. They believed the Germans were incapable of launching a major offensive. When the shells started raining down on the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, many American commanders thought it was just a local spoiling attack. They were wrong. 3 German armies were surging forward across an 80-mile front. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army aimed for the quickest route to Antwerp. Their spearhead was Camp Paper, a massive armored column led by the ruthless Joachim Paper. His orders were to ignore his flanks, ignore prisoners, and drive Helfer Leather to Meuse. But almost immediately, the lateness of the offensive began to manifest in the friction of the terrain. The roads of the Ardennes, which Hitler had studied on flat maps in a bunker, were in reality narrow, winding, and icy. The massive King Tiger tanks, terrifying machines of war, were too wide for the bridges and too heavy for the roadbeds. Within hours of the launch, the German blitzkrieg turned into the world's largest traffic jam. The sheer volume of vehicles trying to squeeze through single-lane forest tracks meant that the rear echelons were stuck miles behind the front. Paper's column, despite its ferocity, was halted not by American tank destroyers initially, but by blown bridges and mines. American engineers, realizing the danger, began blowing bridges right in front of the German tanks. This was where the delay in launching the offensive hurt the most. Had they attacked months earlier, perhaps the American defensive doctrine wouldn't have been as honed. But by late 1944, American combat engineers were masters of demolition. In the center, General Manchefeld's 5th Panzer Army had more success. They bypassed strong points and surrounded 2 regiments of the 106th Division on the Schnee Eifel. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. But even here, the victory was consuming precious time. The Americans, though surrounded and outgunned, were fighting back with a stubbornness the Germans hadn't expected. Small groups of GIs, isolated and cut off, refused to run. At places like Lanzerath, a single platoon of 18 men from the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon held up an entire German parachute battalion for a whole day. This 18-man delay might seem insignificant on a map of millions, but in a plan that required minute-perfect timing, it was disastrous. That one day of delay meant the German columns arrived at the next town just as American reinforcements were pulling in. Fuel was already becoming a crisis by the second day. The German tanks were thirsty beasts. They were burning fuel just idling in traffic jams. Paper's unit was desperately scanning maps for American fuel depots. They came tantalizingly close to millions of gallons of gasoline at Stavelot and Spa, but the Americans, reacting with frantic energy, set the fuel on fire or moved it just in time. The Germans watched their strategic lifeblood go up in smoke. The weather, which was supposed to be their ally, was a double-edged sword. The fog grounded the Allied planes, yes, but the mist and the snow also blinded the German commanders. They couldn't coordinate their artillery effectively. The mud slowed the infantry. The Hitler weather was protecting them from the air, but killing them on the ground. By December 18th, just 48 hours into the offensive, the timetable was broken. The Germans should have been at the Meuse River. Instead, they were still fighting in the border towns. The element of shock was fading. The Allied command, initially paralyzed by confusion, was waking up. General Eisenhower, in a move that showed his logistical genius, realized this was an opportunity. He saw that the Germans had come out of their concrete fortifications and into the open. Eisenhower ordered the 7th Armored Division to rush to the vital road hub of St. Vith. He ordered the 101st Airborne Division, resting in Reims, to load onto trucks and race to the town of Bastogne. The race for the roads was on. If the Germans could capture these crossroads, they might still make up for the lost time. If the Americans got there first, the offensive would be channeled into a kill zone. The delay in launching the offensive meant that the American army in Europe was at its peak strength in terms of mobility. Trucks, jeeps, and half-tracks moved entire divisions hundreds of miles in a single night. A German army moving at the speed of horses and foot soldiers was trying to outrun an American army moving on rubber tires and gasoline. The collision was coming at the crossroads, and the outcome would determine the fate of the Western Front. There are names on a map that mean nothing until history paints them in blood. Bastogne was just a market town where 7 roads met, but in December 1944, it became the rock that broke the wave of the German advance. The failure to secure this town quickly was a definitive proof that the offensive was doomed. If you're fascinated by the turning points of battle, ensure you are subscribed, so we can bring you more from the front lines of history. As the German 5th Panzer Army surged westward, they bypassed resistance where they could, flowing like water around a rock. But Bastogne could not be bypassed. The road network in the Ardennes is sparse. To move an army of tanks, you need pavement, not mud. 7 paved roads radiated out of Bastogne, like the spokes of a wheel. Whoever held the town controlled the movement of the entire southern shoulder of the offensive. The Germans arrived at the outskirts of Bastogne just as the trucks of the 101st Airborne Division were unloading. The paratroopers were tired, low on ammunition, and lacking winter clothing. They had no white camouflage suits to hide in the snow. They were short on artillery, but they had beaten the Germans to the town by a margin of hours. This was the lateness of the German offensive in its most tactical form. Had the German columns not been delayed by the traffic jams and the stubborn resistance at the border, they would have walked into an empty Bastogne. Instead, they found a screaming eagles. The Germans encircled the town, cutting it off from the rest of the American army. They laid siege to it. But a siege takes time the Germans did not have. General Manchufel asked the American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, to surrender. McAuliffe's response was a single, legendary word: nuts. This defiance was a strategic disaster for Berlin. Hitler's plan required the panzers to keep rolling west. Instead, entire divisions of German armor and infantry were tied down trying to crack the Bastogne nut. They pounded the town with artillery. They launched wave after wave of attacks. But the paratroopers, fighting from foxholes and cellars, held the line. While the Germans were fixated on Bastogne, the Allied response was gathering momentum. This is where the context of the provided transcript about Montgomery becomes relevant. To the north of the Bulge, Eisenhower had placed the American 1st and 9th Armies under Field Marshal Montgomery's command. Montgomery, methodical and cautious, was organizing a massive defensive backstop. He was tidying up the lines, as he put it, ensuring that even if the Germans broke through, they would run into a wall of British steel behind the Meuse. To the south, General George Patton was performing a miracle. In a staff meeting on December 19th, Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take to turn his Third Army, which was attacking east into Germany, 90 degrees north to attack the German flank. Patton said, "I can do it in 48 hours. The other generals laughed, thinking he was boasting. But Patton wasn't joking. He had already issued the code words. Patton's army disengaged from combat, spun around on icy roads, and drove north with incredible speed. This maneuver was only possible because of American mechanization and logistical superiority. The Germans, relying on horse-drawn artillery and dwindling fuel stocks, could not match this tempo. The counterattack was coming before the German attack, had even reached its halfway point. Inside the German command bunkers, the mood was darkening. The commanders knew the timetable was dead. They were not at the Meuse. They had not captured Antwerp. They were stuck fighting a war of attrition in the woods, exactly the kind of war they couldn't win. The bulge in the line was becoming a trap. They had driven deep into Allied territory, creating a long, exposed flank that was vulnerable to Patton from the south. And then, the final element of the tragedy appeared. The sky began to clear. For a week, the Germans had operated under a blanket of gray mist, safe from the terrible wrath of the Allied air forces. They had prayed for this weather. But weather is transient. The high-pressure ridge that Hitler's meteorologists had predicted was moving out. On December 23rd, the temperature dropped, the ground froze solid, and the sun came out. It was a beautiful, bright winter day. To the German soldier looking up from his foxhole, it was the most terrifying sight in the world. The blue sky meant that the J-bows, the Allied fighter bombers, were coming back. The window of opportunity, opened by the weather, was slamming shut. The offensive was now exposed, stalled, and about to be hammered from above. The roar of aircraft engines on December 23, 1944, sounded like salvation to the besieged Americans in Bastogne, but to the German panzer crews, it was the sound of the end. The clearing of the weather marked the moment where the offensive shifted from a desperate gamble to a verified suicide pact. Before we witness the destruction of the German armor from the skies, make sure you click subscribe to support our detailed historical analysis. The return of Allied air power was absolute. Thousands of sorties were flown on the first clear day. See, 47 transport planes dropped tons of supplies, ammunition, and medical gear to the 101st Airborne in Bastogne, ensuring they could hold out indefinitely. 47 Thunderbolts and RAF Typhoons roamed the roads behind the German lines, hunting for anything that moved. The German supply columns, already struggling with the icy roads, were decimated. Fuel trucks, the most precious assets the Germans possessed, were blown up miles from the tanks that desperately needed them. The Panzerlehr Division and the 2nd Panzer Division, the spearheads that had advanced the furthest, getting within sight of the Meuse River, ran dry. They parked their tanks in the fields and waited, watching the skies, helpless. This was the ultimate consequence of the offensive coming too late. By late 1944, the disparity in air power was comical. The Luftwaffe launched a desperate operation called Bodenplatte on January 1st, trying to destroy Allied planes on the ground. They destroyed hundreds of aircraft, but they lost pilots they couldn't replace. The Allies replaced their planes within a week. The Germans had spent their last chip in the air and gained nothing. On the ground, Patton's Third Army smashed into the southern flank of the Bulge on December 26. His 4th Armored Division broke through the encirclement of Bastogne, opening a corridor to the trapped paratroopers. The siege was broken. The German 5th Panzer Army was now fighting for its survival, caught between the hammer of Patton and the anvil of the American defenses in the north. General Manschufel and Field Marshal Model begged Hitler to allow a retreat. They argued that the operation had failed. The objective of Antwerp was a fantasy. The sensible military decision was to withdraw to the West Wall, Siegfried Line, save the remaining tanks and men, and prepare for the inevitable Soviet offensive in the east. Hitler refused. He was in a state of denial. He ordered the attacks to continue. He believed that the alliance between Britain and America was cracking. He pointed to the press conference given by Montgomery, the very subject of the document we've analyzed, as proof. Montgomery had claimed credit for saving the Americans, infuriating Bradley and Patton. Hitler thought this political squabbling meant the military alliance would fall apart. He was wrong. While the generals bickered and the politicians argued, the soldiers on the ground fought with unified purpose. Eisenhower, acting as a supreme diplomat, smoothed over cracks. The political crisis did not stop the artillery shells from falling on German positions. The political victory Hitler hoped for was as illusory as the military one. The fighting in January 1945 became a grim, freezing slaughter. The Germans were pushed back, mile by bloody mile. They were fighting in snow that was knee-deep. Frostbite took as many men as bullets. the equipment they abandoned littering the roads of the Ardennes. Tiger tanks out of gas, artillery pieces with no horses to pull them, represented the last offensive capability of the Third Reich. The delay in the retreat was just as fatal as the delay in the attack. By keeping his army in the Bulge for weeks after the battle was clearly lost, Hitler ensured they would be ground down to nothing. Had he withdrawn in late December, he might have saved 50,000 men and hundreds of tanks to defend the Rhine or Berlin. Instead, he fed them into the wood chipper, and while the eyes of the German high command were fixed on the tiny villages of Belgium, a storm of biblical proportions was gathering in the east. The Soviet Union had watched the Battle of the Bulge with interest. Stalin had even accelerated the start date of his own offensive at the request of Churchill to relieve pressure on the West. Because the Germans had stripped the Eastern Front to build the Ardennes Force, the line in Poland was paper thin. There were no reserves left. They were all freezing to death in Belgium. The lateness of the Western offensive meant it overlapped perfectly with the start of the Eastern collapse. By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. The Germans had been pushed back to their starting lines. They had gained nothing but a delay of the inevitable, purchased at a price they could not afford. The offensive that was meant to change the war only served to accelerate the end. Before we conclude with a final verdict on this tragedy, subscribe and comment below. Do you think the war would have ended sooner if Hitler hadn't attacked in the Ardennes? The butcher's bill for the Ardennes offensive was staggering. The Germans suffered nearly 100,000 casualties. The Americans suffered 89,000. The bloodiest battle in U.S. history. But the Americans could replace their losses. The draft was still churning out GIs. The factories of Detroit were still churning out Shermans. Germany was bankrupt. The most damning aspect of the offensive was what it did to the defense of the Reich. When the Soviets launched the Vistula-Oder offensive on January 12, 1945, they tore through the German lines like paper. The 6th Panzer Army, which was meant to be the fire brigade for the East, was stuck in the mud of the Ardennes, its tanks broken and its fuel tanks empty. By the time they were transferred east, it was too late. The Russians were already at the Oder River, 40 miles from Berlin. The delay of the counteroffensive was not just a matter of weeks. It was a matter of strategic error. The kind of blitzkrieg operation Hitler envisioned belonged in 1940, not 1944. In 1940, the Germans had air superiority, better tactics, and faced a disorganized enemy. In 1944, they had none of those things. The offensive was an anachronism. It was a dinosaur trying to survive in a new ice age. Furthermore, the offensive highlighted the complete disconnect between Hitler and reality. Just like Montgomery's press conference revealed a disconnect in Allied relations, Hitler's planning revealed a disconnect in Axis capabilities. He believed that willpower could overcome fuel shortages. He believed that the surprise of the attack would shatter American morale. Instead, the Battle of the Bulge hardened American resolve. The GIs who survived the initial shock, who froze in Bastogne and fought at St. Vith, emerged as the most lethal fighting force on the continent. They were no longer the green troops of 1942. They were veterans who had beaten the best the Wehrmacht had left. The political crisis between Britain and America, sparked by Montgomery's arrogant press conference, was real, but it was resolved by the reality of the victory. As Churchill stated in his speech to the House of Commons, United States troops have done almost all the fighting and have suffered almost all the losses. The battle cemented the American dominance of the alliance. The British, exhausted by 5 years of war, were now clearly the junior partner. The German attempt to split the alliance had ironically strengthened the American claim to leadership. In the end, Wacht am Rhine was a decision born of desperation and executed too late to matter. Had the Germans used those reserves to build a deep defense in the West and East, they might prolong the war by months, perhaps making the Allied advance into Germany a slow, grinding misery that cost hundreds of thousands more lives. But by attacking, Hitler shortened the war. He burned his furniture to heat the house for one last night. The Bulge was not a near victory. It was the death rattle of the German military machine. The silence that fell over the Ardennes in February 1945 was the silence of a graveyard, marking the place where the Third Reich spent its last coin and received nothing in return. Thank you for watching this series on the strategic failures of World War II. If you want to understand the other side of the hill, how the Americans recovered from the shock, click the video on screen now. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share history with the world.